means slaves,
did not build this country. So there's no doubt that slavery was indeed an evil. It resulted in the abuse of millions of people throughout the world. Only an insane person would try to deny this, which is why this is very much going to be an anti-slavery video. Not that anyone being serious is openly pro-slavery these days anyways, for the most part, at least. I'll have more on that later on in the video. Anyways, slavery occurs when the natural right to self-ownership are given to some, but not to others. This results in a system that is not only immoral, but actually very economically unsound. The reality is that slavery did not have a positive economic impact, or even a neutral one. As it turns out, it's mostly negative. However, lately there's been a very big problem, which is that some people on the far left are able to correctly identify the fact that slavery was bad, pat on the back for them there, at least in part, but then fail to understand the true economic impact of slavery and how it actually operates, resulting in the spread of some pretty silly misinformation, largely stemming from the 1619 Project, the Cathedral of Woke, resulting in this nonsensical propaganda making its way to children's cartoons, with probably the most well-known example in the last year being that really bad Proud Family episode. This misinformation can be mostly summarized in the following false claims. The claim that slavery was profitable and good for the economy and even paid for the Industrial Revolution, specifically the slave trade in respect to the agricultural industry of the 1700s to 1800s. Then you also have the claim that Western civilization was built by slaves and that America was founded on the ideals of slavery in 1619, that's where the 1619 Project usually comes in. And then there's the claim that the continued success of Western civilization is somehow also built on the backs of the descendants and legacy of slavery, and that they are thus owed Muh Reparations due to the alleged systemic racism. Now, the arguments used to present these points are largely based on historical revisionism, bad economic theory, very bad economic theory, collective guilt, and faulty reasoning. But what is perhaps more interesting is that a large number of breadtube cathedral-like grifters have actually been throwing their support behind some of these claims. Thus, the purpose of this video is twofold, to not only explain why this propaganda is false, but also to show how this is being irresponsibly spread by far-left pseudo-intellectuals. And yes, the word irresponsible ought to be used here, because as you will find out, these people in their prestige-seeking and virtue-signaling behavior have actually bought into a pro-slavery argument. Perhaps some of them realize that what they are saying relies on pro-slavery talking points. Perhaps they don't. But I'm not going to be the judge of who and who is not a useful idiot here, because either way it's important to recognize their colossal error. Because what makes all of this so strange is the fact that these claims are actually quite easy to refute. In fact, some of the statements made in the 1619 Project are so outlandishly wrong that even Wikipedia admits that it contains inaccurate information, despite Wikipedia's track record of usually regurgitating this type of disinformation. So that's actually a very big red flag right off the bat. This is why you may have already seen quite a few videos or perhaps read a few essays that debunk the 1619 Project and related claims from a historical point of view. What I will be doing differently in this video is I will be explaining why these claims are wrong from a rational standpoint, as opposed to just citing historical facts to the contrary. This way you will be able to walk away from this video with a more straightforward, reason-based understanding of why what these people are saying is so ridiculously wrong. I'll start with the first of these claims, the idea that slavery is profitable and beneficial to capitalist economies overall. So this claim has largely been popularized in what is known as the New History of Capitalism and can be found in books such as Slavery's Capitalism, A New History of American Economic Development, which tries to make the argument that economic innovation was largely driven and incentivized by the cotton trade, which was of course at the time of the early to mid 1800s a trade that relied on slavery. This book has been the target of various refutations from a historian's perspective, such as the one by Philip Magnus. But the best way to understand why slavery isn't actually good for the economy and certainly does not pay for any industrial revolution is to understand that the core reasoning mistake is a post hoc ergo propter hoc. They are trying to make the argument that some people made money off slavery and then an industrial revolution happened, therefore slavery must have helped fund said revolution. This is not valid reasoning. When Y happens after X, there are some possibilities. Either X really did cause Y, or X could have also had no effect on Y. But there is also a third, more interesting relationship that actually occurs when it's negative, when X was in fact preventing Y, and the sudden absence of X is what actually allows Y to happen. And this particular possibility is what really makes post hoc ergo propter hoc reasoning so bad. A simple to understand example would be, say, a locked door. Lock X is preventing door Y from being opened. Someone comes along with a key and opens the door. This is an obvious example where anybody who does not suffer from some kind of disability can understand that it was not the lock that caused the door to be opened, but rather the lock was the problem, and it was the key that got rid of the problem, allowing the door to be opened. But it's an important analogy to showcase the extremely dumb conclusions that one can come to when people engage in this kind of post hoc reasoning without thinking things through. So then, what does this have to do with the far left's recent takes on slavery and capitalism? Well, everything. When you look at the history of slavery and subsequent industrial revolutions and boosted GDP, we do in fact see an economy take off after a period of slavery. But strangely, it tends to take off once slavery has either ended or otherwise has been abolished or was on the downturn anyway. Let's imagine for a moment that you are a farmer, and you have a problem. Another farm which competes with the same product as your own has an army of robot humanoids working for them, which allows them to sell their product for much cheaper. These robots are able to vastly outcompete any farm equipment that you have or anything else an engineer you could hire could come up with. The only way you could possibly have a chance is to buy a robot army for yourself. But the cost for each robot is just too expensive. You are effectively locked out of the competition via a very large financial barrier to entry. Now imagine that it's actually the early 1800s, and when we talk about robots, we are actually referring to slaves. Do you see the problem here? Because of the level of technological advancement at this time, the situation is even worse, far more dire, as there's even less potential things that could compete with the slave owners. The existence of slavery thus not only harms the slaves, it hurts market competition for non-slave owners as well. And since the plantation slave owners already had something very lucrative going for them, they had little to no reason to invest in better technology. But perhaps an even bigger problem is the labor of the slaves themselves. When asking whether or not the institution of slavery was beneficial to the overall economy, the most important question to ask is actually a very simple one. Is slavery more efficient than hiring employees? What if, in the United States, instead of abolishing slavery, all the plantation owners in the South all got together and said, you know what? Slavery just isn't working out, guys. Let's free all the slaves and then hire laborers for wages and compete with prices of that labor instead. You know, kinda like the North, which also begs the question, how exactly did the North beat the South anyways? If the South was so enriched by slavery, shouldn't the Civil War have been an easy win? This is a pretty critical question to ask, because if slavery is indeed less efficient than the free market, then the entire argument for it boosting the Industrial Revolution completely falls apart, as they would have been better off without slavery, and the Industrial Revolution could have potentially happened sooner, or even been more effective. Who knows, we could have colonized the moon by now. This would mean that the relation between X and Y in the post hoc argument would indeed be a negative one. Oh, and a side note, this is also part of what I meant earlier when I mentioned that leftists accidentally are adopting pro-slavery positions. If you were to jump into watching this as a debate and see one person arguing that slavery is economically efficient and the other person arguing that free workers and market competition with employment and wages and all that creates a more flourishing economy, it's pretty obvious which side is making a utilitarian pro-slavery argument. And this is exactly what leftists making all these claims would have to support in order to maintain logical consistency. Yeah, big oof right there. Kind of pathetic and cringe once you realize it, isn't it? The woketoids really didn't think this one through very well, did they now? Anyways, as it turns out, slavery is actually communist garbage. It is an inefficient system for many of the same reasons that socialist economic policies are inefficient. When it comes to incentivizing people to do stuff, there are mainly two options. You either offer them a reward for compliance, or offer them punishment for non-compliance. This is why Marxist-Leninist states always had, or in the case of North Korea still have, forced labor and gulag. This enriches members of the party, but the economy of the country overall, not so much. You inevitably end up with a command economy, the knowledge problem, and the economic calculation problem. And when it comes to slavery, you see similar issues. What is the value of the slave's labor anyways? Is it the price that the slave was purchased for? Is it some surplus labor value that is being extracted from them? Well, that's a non-starter. Or is it the wage that the slave would work for in the scenario that they were free men seeking voluntary employment? In the case of freedom, employers must compete with each other to offer higher wages to attract more skilled workers, which then leads to more skilled workers, which then leads to more economic output, and then of course, free men are able to take the money they earn and reinvest it into the economy by purchasing goods and services that they actually want, which increases the demand for said goods and services, as opposed to slaves who are basically just getting whatever little hut their masters want to give them in order to keep them alive, as opposed to allowing them to participate in the cycle of economic development. And before you know it, if I were to continue on like this, I'm suddenly going to start sounding like economics in one lesson now, aren't I? Or an even simpler way to understand this is that the more economically free people are, the better they are able to contribute to a growing economy. A slave, on the other hand, has zero economic freedom, which makes the plantation somewhat of a micro-communist dictatorship in many ways. Slavery enriches the plantation owner in much the same way that impressive communist dictatorships enrich the dictators. They may get to live the high life, but the restrictive economic system they create ultimately makes their country's overall development worse. When the people are free to work and put their money where they want, they create greater incentives for goods and services in the market, which then leads to incentives to more efficiently industrialize to produce those goods and services Cue Industrial Revolution. Slavery was not the key, slavery was the lock. So then, what are the kinds of dumb things that one might say when they don't understand this? Well, let's use everyone's favorite Voosh as a perfect example.
There are some 700,000 slaves in Africa today. Right.
How many imprisoned people are there in America, just out of curiosity? 2.12 million people were incarcerated in the US in 2020. Now, of course, not every imprisoned American is what we would call a slave, but they are a part of the economic bloc that is used for modern slave labor.
African bodies are being sold today like they were sold then. And no, they are not being purchased by any country of white men. In fact,
European countries aren't buying modern African slaves? Dude, that's wild. Really? Well, they're not being bought by. Their labor is being used, though. You don't have to buy the slaves. All you really have to do is contract the slave owners to use the labor of those slaves, which is nice because it means you're not technically participating in the slave trade. You're just benefiting from all the economics of participating in the slave trade.
Alright, so let's talk about the economics of modern-day slavery for a bit. First off, if we're talking strictly prison labor, that's a big non-starter for the overall economy, or to claim that that's efficient is just nonsensical. Sure, there are some people who make money off prison labor, but this ignores the overhead costs. Just going by US statistics, depending on your state, it costs the taxpayer anywhere between 20 to 60k per year per inmate. And things cost over $80 billion to maintain the system, in comparison to the so-called profits of $2 billion in goods and $9 billion in services that is often cited. This brings us back to the problem of benefiting the plantation owner at the cost of everyone else. If it is not actually beneficial for the economy and the taxpayer is being forced to subsidize the system, then implying that it is efficient in any way doesn't really work. Which, by the way, that's another problem with state-sanctioned slavery. Slaves, as it turns out, do not like being slaves. That's kind of an obvious one there. This means the threat of force must be used against them to get them to do any work and prevent them from escaping. Now, this force obviously comes with a resource cost. When it is enforced by the state, this means that slavery is always a taxpayer-subsidized system, just further proving its inefficiency. And if we are talking about third world countries that either have sweatshop labor or other forms of dishonest business practices, which can be debatably called slavery since they are the result of oppressive government regimes, crooked policies, and other forms of corruption in those countries, well, that brings up the simple question: would trade with these countries be better off if they were less corrupt and more free? The answer to that is a massive yes. Countries overwhelmingly benefit from trade with countries that take a hardline stance against slavery, and countries mostly trade with more economically advanced societies anyways. Some lame banana republics may be profitable for a select few, but their countries would actually see significantly more trade volume if they were less corrupt and adopted more free market policies. In other words, the world economy would be more efficient overall if these third world countries did not have these problems. So in many ways, this pro-slavery type of argument is very similar to the fixed pie fallacy, the false assumption that economics always has to be zero-sum. The reality is you could take any country in the bottom 50 of GDP and then boost their GDP per capita to be about the same level as Ireland, and it would be entirely positive sum. Voosh, in his response to Owens, only is providing a thin moralistic argument against slavery, but because he lacks any economic understanding, he is unable to correctly identify any solution to these problems other than saying Republicans bad, capitalism bad. Ooga booga. Instead, accidentally making a pro-slavery argument without realizing it, which with a moral consequentialist like Voosh is deeply concerning. More on those concerns in the last part of the video. Now, one thing I do have to point out before moving on to the second claim is that saying white people abolished slavery is drastically inferior to saying Western capitalism obsoleted slavery. When you try to say that white people abolished slavery, you open yourself up to all these silly, pedantic nitpicks about how some king 3,000 years ago managed to temporarily abolish slavery, and it then lasted for 10 years or whatever. If you watch the entire video by Voosh here, you would notice that this is exactly what he does when Owen says this. These statements in terms of what you are trying to say aren't functionally that different, but the latter is far more effective because it doesn't have any annoying technical errors that would force socialists like Voosh to show their hand. Voosh eventually did mask slip that he believes slavery is an economic boon anyway, but it would have been a lot easier if Owens instead talked about Western culture and how it was capitalist policies that led to the downfall of slavery. Anyways, now for that second part. America was founded on slaves and built by slaves and all that. So once you understand that Western capitalism is in fact antithetical to slavery rather than something which propagates it, and that the Industrial Revolution would have actually been better off had slavery been abolished sooner or even never existed, it's pretty easy to figure out why the core argument of the 1619 Project is basically dead on arrival if it's trying to critique capitalism. But But there are still a few things that need to be pointed out here. First off, if slaves didn't build America, who did then? It's kind of a nonsensical phrase in a way because the term built America can technically subjectively mean anything you want it to mean, which is probably why the 1619 Project is such effective propaganda, because it has a nice little built-in mechanism for shifting the goalposts whenever they need to. But ignoring that, the most honest answer to who or what built America would be to look at economic output and what from the 1800s to early 1900s is still in use in America today and still benefits Americans. Which would make the answer by far to look at who built the US infrastructure. Infrastructure, factories, and construction are all the major things that an economy needs to increase the volume of trade in order to take advantage of industrialization properly. And if you look at a map of the US from the early 1900s, you will notice that there are still many roads we still use today. And of course, you need warehouses and rail to store and move all those goods as well. So who built all this stuff? Well, the answer is pretty simple. It was mostly Western European immigrants, especially the Irish, who built America. When millions of Irish fled the potato famine, they came to the US and were willing to take harder, backbreaking work in construction that came with the higher risks in order to build their wealth. Also, many Chinese immigrants helped build America. They came fleeing war in their own country in the mid-1800s in hopes to find gold and wealth, and many of them found themselves working in railroad construction. All of this combined with technology advancements in coal and later oil are essentially what built what eventually led to become the modern United States of America. When reading the 1619 Project, I found that the biggest lies were those of exaggeration and disparagement, overstating grievances while downplaying anything that didn't agree with its narrative. It barely mentioned the Irish at all, and only mentioned the Chinese in the context of victimhood, while not mentioning what the Chinese actually did. Strangely, there was no mention of this type of discrimination when it came to the Irish, even though it existed in similar amounts. It's like they were trying to apply their postmodernist view of POC to a time where such views didn't really exist, and then looking for whatever evidence they could find to support said view, kind of like some ideological version of Roko's basilisk. And that's the biggest problem with the 1619 Project from a rationalist standpoint. If you search for evidence of discrimination as explanation for any event, you will always find it, because there are unfortunately numerous examples of humans acting crappy towards one another. The problem is the issue of degree. How much of an impact any discrimination had on any outcome can be argued incessantly, and when outcomes are used as evidence of discrimination on top of this, their argument effectively becomes unfalsifiable and thus impossible to have any kind of honest discussion on. For example, I stubbed my toe in 1993. If I wanted to, I could claim that this gave me extreme PTSD and blame every bad thing that has ever happened to me as a result of the pain from stubbing my toe 30 years ago. This of course would be an absurd argument, but here's the thing, you technically would not be able to prove me wrong, as it's entirely subjective how much impact any given event had on one's future decisions. It's just a way to set up a framework that allows them to exploit the subjectivity of the situation so that they can, again, endlessly shift the goalpost. And if you go through the 1619 Project, that's pretty much all it really is. They find a historical grievance, and then present that grievance as if it's vitally important to today's outcomes. Regardless of whether or not the grievance is true or exaggerated, the problem is they don't actually present any real evidence for its impact. If this is all starting to sound like the equity fallacy in some ways, where inequity is assumed without evidence to always result from discrimination, and the burden of proof is then shifted elsewhere to somehow prove the negative, then you would be correct. In fact, Ibram X. Kendi, the guy who wrote the book that the equity fallacy refers to, and how to be an anti-racist, is actually one of the authors of the 1619 Project, writing its penultimate chapter. As expected, he uses the equity fallacy to defend the 1619 Project's ideals. In fact, he even doubles down on it, suggesting that the ideals of racial progress is propaganda and non-existent unless his utopian ideal of equity is achieved. So beyond exaggerating the historical basics on who built America and how it was built, the 1619 Project relies on Kendi's definition of anti-racism, which is that racism is anything that results in racial inequity. This is an absurd definition that, pushed to its logical conclusions, would allow people to argue that any kind of difference between any two individuals for any reason under any circumstances is racist. This is obviously unachievable and absurd, as any two people in any kind of situation will always have some form of inequity between them. So ironically, Kendi's fallacy actually guarantees that race relations never get resolved and always remain on edge due to it painting the racism problem in such a way as to make it unfixable. So once again, I must point out the correlation that race relations in the United States started to go downhill once wokeness and racial grievance politics in the media kicked into woke overdrive around the early 2010s. And all this nonsense coming from Kendi, along with this garbage like the 1619 Project, is specifically why this correlation exists, because these pseudo-intellectuals have redefined racism in such a way that racial relations can never actually be resolved. So how about BreadTube's take on the 1619 Project? Well, for that, Sean has provided.
I find the main idea behind the 1619 project to be vitally important and sorely needed, but the actual project itself is, in a few ways, kind of disappointing, which is unfortunate. The problem is that the principles of democracy run counter to the principles of capitalism. And this is the main reason I personally find the 1619 project to be rather disappointing. When it comes time to criticize capitalism, it doesn't go far enough. Another essay in the 1619 project is titled "American Capitalism is Brutal. You can trace that to the plantation." And that essay does as it says. It looks at modern economic inequality and injustices and finds roots or comparisons for those things in the practices of the slave trade. The essay highlights that it wasn't only racism motivating the actions of the slave owners, there were systemic financial incentives for a lot of what they were doing.
Now, I already kind of touched on this video from Sean in my BreadTube episode on him, but the basic problem in the entire video is that he is trying to defend the 1619 project and push the false claim that capitalism is when slavery by refuting pedantic problems in the 1776 report, which is part of the broader 1776 project, which is basically a boomer tier response to the 1619 project, which commits many of the same cherry-picking sins that the 1619 project commits. His argument is basically a fallacy, which is when a bad idea is defended by refuting a bad refutation of the bad idea. Not exactly impressive. But also, on a side note here, here's a silly thing to point out, is that if you read the 1776 report as a parody of the 1619 project, instead of taking it seriously, it actually does kind of in a way refute it, because it shows how you can cherry-pick history and downplay things that disagree with you to basically say the exact opposite of what the 1619 project is saying. Anyways, the core problem of what Sean just said is that he fails to realize that it's not capitalism that was incompatible with getting rid of slavery, but rather that slavery is actually one of the flaws of democracy. That may seem like a pretty hefty red pill to swallow, but if you think about it and look at the historical evidence, it's kind of, well, exactly what happened. You see, the lefties are not wrong about everything. In this case, they are not wrong that the United States should have been founded with the abolition of slavery baked in. Slavery should never have happened. If the 1619 project is right about anything, it's this. The USA would have indeed been better off without it. But not just morally, financially as well, and that's where the disagreements and that's the things the left gets so horribly wrong comes in. But what they also completely miss, and where Sean's error lies, is that it's precisely because the Founding Fathers decided to compromise on slavery and then vote on those compromises, instead of doing the correct thing and baking defense of people's natural rights to self-ownership into the United States Constitution, no exceptions, that we got into this mess in the first place. You know, that running joke that democracy is two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner. Well, that's the issue here. A huge portion of Founding Fathers were slave owners, and so the first iteration of Congress was leery to get rid of it. Democracy doesn't always defend people's natural rights. It only does so if the voters involved are being rational, which they very often are not. So Sean is committing the classic error of causal fallacy and misplaced blame. Yes, the Founding Fathers screwed up on slavery, but it was in fact a very democratic screw-up, not so much a support for free trade screw-up. Of course, in defense of this, you could point out that blacks didn't get to vote early on, so it doesn't count, but that's completely missing the point. Maybe having more people being able to vote at the time would have resulted in slavery getting voted out, or maybe the slave owners would fund enough propaganda to make people believe that even the non-slave owners needed slavery to exist, and it would not have gotten voted out anyways. Simply adding more people to the room does not make them smarter. Democracy has its value mainly as a system of compromise, but as it turns out, compromise doesn't always defend people's rights. One final note before moving on is that there is one last major part of Sean's refutation of the 1776 project that needs to be addressed. The whole cultural Marxism versus Marxist cultural analysis is a textbook example of postmodernist obscurantism. It serves the purpose of a grift which allows them to falsely accuse anyone who talks about identity politics on the left as being engaged in some kind of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. What's interesting is that Sean himself engaged in the very type of analysis that the 1776 report was talking about during the first half of his response to it. So he's basically saying that this kind of thing isn't happening right after engaging in that very behavior that allegedly isn't happening. If you want a more in-depth understanding of how this grift works, I recommend either checking out my Muh Wikipedia video or SFO's video on the socialist intellectual ecosystem. But for now, it's time to move on to the last chapter, Muh Reparations. The 1619 project makes its arguments for reparations in its final chapter, justice. The basic idea is that African Americans were stolen from and they have a right to seek what was stolen returned to them. They had to work without pay and now they want their pay. On the surface of things, this doesn't sound like such a bad idea, if you don't think about it for too long at least. But of course, the problems start to arise when you do consider the reality of reparations and how they would actually operate. The basic problem is that it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to actually give out reparations in such a way that does not involve collective guilt and the violation of other people's property rights, or in some cases, shifting of the burden of proof onto the accused. There are generally two ways reparations are proposed. It is either proposed to be given out based on the ethnic collective, or it is proposed to be given out based on the individual. The most common is the first, race-based reparations. This is easy to refute rationally for the similar reasons to why collective guilt is easy to refute. Crimes do not happen to collectives, and cannot happen, as there is no esoteric collective overmind for which to target. Tragedy can strike in such a way as to disproportionately target those who share a specific aspect of their identity, such as an ethnically targeted genocide. However, the actual crime itself always happens to a multitude of individuals. So when people decide to go the collectivist route on reparations, they are simply presuming guilt based on something that may or may not have happened to them. Not all blacks in the United States descended from slaves, and not all whites descended from slave owners. In some cases, it's actually the opposite. So to demand this payment to be on the grounds of the collective means to be okay with punishing certain individuals for a crime that never happened and having them pay restitution for a property that was never stolen to a person who never had anything to do with the event in question. This is clearly a moral injustice, not just from a universal ethics and natural law point of view, but it doesn't even make sense from a utilitarian ethical point of view, as a society which happily extracts wealth from people for non-existent crimes pushed to its logical conclusions would find itself operating very inefficiently. That may seem obvious enough, but what people miss is that this also applies to the degree of slavery's impact as well. Even among the whites who did own slaves, not all of them have inherited anything from it. For instance, say a slave owner passed his wealth to his grandson, and then said grandson then stupidly squandered his wealth, and then his great-great-great-grandson is then born into modern times in poverty to a single mother. So does the descendant of this slave owner owe reparations then? Or how about the subject of mixed-race individuals? Does someone who is the descendant of both slaves and slave owners owe reparations, or are they owed? There's also the issue of economics. How would ethnically targeted collective reparations for slavery even be carried out? The general answer from the left is that the government will do it via taxation and borrowing through the Fed. This means that everyone not on the receiving end of reparations, including any Irish, Asian, Mexican, or other immigrants who never owned any slaves, is effectively being aggressively forced to pay reparations via inflation and a portion of their paycheck. This can create some absolutely insane injustices. For instance, say a second-gen Mexican immigrant who is earning minimum wage would then have to take up a second job to afford all those increased prices at the store via inflation. You could argue that his second job would actually be a form of state-induced slavery, as an unintended consequence. And that's basically the problem with collective guilt-based reparations for slavery. The woke scolds are trying to resolve slavery with more slavery. Another big oof. So since option A is obviously both evil and oh so very stupid, that brings us to option B, handling reparations on an individual case-by-case basis. In other words, we are now dealing with inherited guilt. This is a much more complex philosophical topic because while most of the time inherited guilt makes little sense, there are specific circumstances where it kind of does. For example, say Bob's father steals an awesome classic car, but then passes away a year later and leaves the car to his son. Now, Bob doesn't know his father stole the vehicle and is not guilty for stealing it. However, he is guilty of having possession of property that rightfully belonged to someone else. So let's say in another 3 years during a VIN inspection, it is revealed that Bob actually has a stolen vehicle. Now put yourself in the shoes of the original owner of that vehicle. Would it be fair for them to say, oh, whoops, sorry, you can't have your car back because technically Bob wasn't the thief? Would that not be a steaming load? You'd probably be like, no, screw you, Bob, give me back my darn car. But the problem, of course, is we are not talking 4 years of reparations. We are talking 150 years spanning multiple generations in a crime that actually made the entire economy worse off, which means that even most of the individual descendants of slave owners likely do not have anything left that can be reliably traced. Sure, you can go by outcomes and say more generational wealth, but that would be the equity fallacy. The burden of proof is on the person claiming that the property in question is specifically, in fact, owed to them. And that's the thing with inherited guilt. You can really only inherit the guilt of owning something that doesn't belong to you because that is an act you are willingly participating in. But you can't actually inherit the guilt of the crime itself, because you as an individual didn't do that crime. No African American alive today was ever in bondage, at least not the type we are talking about here, and no descendant of slave owners alive today has ever owned any slaves. So any restitution for the criminal act of kidnapping and forced labor itself is kinda out the window. For instance, say Bob's father instead lost the car, and Bob never even knew about the car. Does Bob owe the car to the original owner? No, because he didn't steal it and he doesn't have it. This is basically why inherited debt that doesn't make sense. There's also another scenario that could throw an even bigger wrench into the machine. What if the car, when stolen, was actually not so awesome? What if Bob's dad actually towed away a classic car that was left in terrible, non-working condition, and that upon leaving the car to Bob then put in more value and work than the car was worth in that state in order to completely restore it to the point where it was even winning classic car competitions? Now things get really complicated. The original owner could claim that he owns the vehicle, but Bob could claim that he owns the renovations and demand he be paid for them, or even take them back if the car is to be transferred to the original owner again. The thing is, this matches the situation of slavery in the United States far more accurately. If you look at the first industrial revolution during the antebellum period compared to the second industrial revolution, the difference in economic output is clear, and push that to modern times of the post-World War II era, and the difference is insurmountable. Any specific piece of property that could be argued to be rightfully owed to a descendant of a slave has likely been traded, renovated, improved, destroyed, then traded, improved again, built over, repaved and repurposed, reconstructed, lost, found, resold, etc., likely dozens, if not hundreds of times over by now. In other words, even when the horrors of collective guilt are avoided, and reparations are done on an individual case-by-case basis, it's still kind of a problem because it presents a logistical and clerical burden of proof nightmare. The process of economic exchange over time sort of creates an unwritten statute of limitations. Technically, property rights never really expire, but there comes a point in history where so many events and interactions and transactions with property that is allegedly stolen over hundreds of years ago stop making any sense, like when Krug stole Ugg's pointy stick back in caveman times. Good luck trying to prove where that stick went, and even bigger luck trying to prove who should own it now, and that's all assuming said stick even still exists today. The writers of the 1619 Project clearly do not understand this, claiming they should be able to figure out who's eligible purely by racial identity. Cringe. What they are pulling here is not just an absurd oversimplification, it also fails for the reasons I just gave on both the grounds of the collective guilt version and the individual version. And to be honest, it's not too hard for any human being capable of reason to see why this is such a broken topic, which is why BreadTube actually mostly shies away from talking about it at length. They just kind of sheepishly support it from the background. For example, people like FD Signifier, who will only fleetingly mention reparations in the context of a different topic. It's like they know it's cringe but still want to support it, which brings me to this clip from Hassanabi.
I'm a descendant of settlers, and I believe in reparations in order to heal our nation.
What the... Wait, is this Black Hammer? Oh my god, is this Black Hammer? As a black person, this has got to be some form of racism. It 1000% is, dude. It straight the comes from a place of otherizing black people. Obviously, it's not as like insidious as just straight up being like black people are not human or whatever think, but like it still comes from like black people, one, can't help themselves. Black people, you know, need to be helped by white people. It's just like when being a radlib goes to like the complete opposite. You know what I mean? Ultimately, though, I do believe in reparations. Just whatever the Black Hammer organization considers to be reparations is absolutely. Talked about this extensively, as a matter of fact, on this broadcast. Black Hammer is a cult. They use like communist aesthetics and whatnot. What? How is reparations racist? No. I am an advocate for reparations. Reparations comes at the systemic level. This is not reparations. Black Hammer is a cult that advocates for reparations by getting white people to pay them directly. That's not reparations.
As is often the case with streamer bros, Hassanabi does not understand the logical conclusions of his own beliefs. Yes, indeed, these white guiltoids are cringe. But here's the funny thing, voluntary donations are actually the only form of reparations that don't really violate people's rights. Cringe, yes, but technically not evil. People like Hassanabi don't understand that the version of reparations they want, aka socialist wealth redistribution through the state, is even worse. What Hassan is doing here is essentially the framing effect. He thinks if reparations are framed in a cool and hip streamer bro way, as opposed to these white guiltoid weirdos, then it becomes a good idea. Well, no, actually, it doesn't. The only thing Hassan is right about here is that yes, what the white guiltoids are doing is indeed racist, but so is ethnic wealth redistribution through the state, Hassan. And sadly, the 1619 Project doesn't seem to understand the conclusions of these beliefs either, stating, white Americans are not the ones who would pay for them, but then later stating, but critically, reparations must include individual cash payments to descendants of the enslaved in order to close the wealth gap. But that's not actually true because they mention that it is to be done by government policy, aka the magical congressional budget money tree, which magically produces wealth because it just does, okay? It's like they either don't understand how monetary supply and inflation works, or they're just hoping that you don't understand it. So what is the conclusion to all of this? Well, it's quite simple really. Slavery is bad. What these far-left progs have unwittingly brought back to life is something known as the King Cotton Defense. That was an argument put forth by antebellum South slave owners that the cotton industry and transatlantic slave trade was just too lucrative and necessary for the early American economy, that there was no way the North could ever challenge the South due to these alleged economic benefits of the slave trade. They even implied that other countries, such as Great Britain, would intervene to save the untouchable king of trade that cotton allegedly was. History, of course, proved them wrong. The South lost, Britain found other means of cotton, Western civilization abolished slavery throughout, and then proceeded to exponentially grow in wealth without slavery. But in this recent attempt by the woke schools to reframe slavery as the economic foundations of America, they are accidentally repeating this nonsense without realizing it, or at least I hope they don't realize it. Because the implications of these claims is that slavery can indeed be beneficial for growth, which simply is not true. And the misguided use of victimhood and fallacious reasoning used within the 1619 Project only serves as a grounds for justification for the same kind of ethnic collective guilt that proved to be an absolute failure in South Africa and Zimbabwe, where collective ethnic guilt was used to justify retaking land, ultimately trying to fix slavery with an indirect form of slavery. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. Ultimately, however, the leftists and libs have a point. We should be teaching kids about slavery, but we should not just teach it as a moral blight. We should also teach it as an economic blight that did humanity absolutely no good whatsoever, and that everyone alive today would be better off had this mistake never occurred. We should not be teaching it in the context of this ridiculous victimhood propaganda that slavery still uniquely benefits certain collective groups today, because that is simply not true. This way, we can pass on this important understanding so as to ensure the mistake of slavery is never repeated. And I don't just mean slavery in the United States, this goes all the way back to BC times. Every one of those societies of the past that committed the error of slavery would have been better off had they adopted moral principles and the right to self-ownership. Slavery was a stupid idea. Slavery is still a stupid idea, and any attempt at slavery in the future will also be a stupid idea. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like, share, subscribe, tip me on Ko-Fi, and leave comments or whatever other algorithm stuff you feel like doing. Till next time.